Today is February 11th, 2022. This is Mordecai, host of the updates, bringing you your daily Elden Ring update. There is a ton of news about Elden Ring today. So I released yesterday's update early as I had a bit of an inkling previews might be dropping later, and I wanted to give myself ample time to sift through it all. And on top of that, we've had some other news happen too, so the first part of this video will just focus on non-spoilery updates like a Kitao interview and such. Then, after that, I will get into the nitty-gritty details of people's hands-on impressions with Elden Ring. Okay, so first of all, the PC specs were released on Steam this morning, and then a few hours later, they took them down, so it says to be determined again. The specs they put up seemed very strange, like a minimum requirement of 12GB of RAM, which not even the highest demanding game requires these days. But since they took it down, we'll have to wait and see what the actual specs will end up being in the next few weeks. Anyway, in some other news, From Software's Yasuhiro Kitao did an interview with Game Bravers in which he explained some new details. Firstly, he confirmed that the HUD for Elden Ring will be changed for the final build of the game. This is because they received a lot of feedback from the network tests where users expressed their feelings about the current HUD as being too basic and simplistic. I didn't personally mind it myself, and while we haven't seen what the final version of the HUD looks like, the outlets who had access to it for a few hours mentioned that the HUD looks worn out now with golden embellishment around its edges. So we'll have to wait and see what that looks like. Anyway, Kitao said that there will not be a boss rush mode in Elden Ring, and they are currently not planning one. I think that's a shame because it was definitely one of the best parts about Sekiro that was added in a later update. While on the topic of bosses though, Kitao also said that many of them have been tuned since the network test. For example, Margit was apparently too difficult for players, so they will balance him for that early point in the game. However, Kitao did confirm that there will be optional bosses that are similar to the difficulty of Orphan of Kos and Midir. The idea is that they didn't want massive roadblocks for players early in the game. And speaking of optional stuff, there will be a ton of hidden secrets and areas in Elden Ring still. Though finding them will still be difficult, there won't be any gestures you'll have to use to get transported to a certain area like in Dark Souls 3. Kitao was then asked about the recent server issues impacting the Souls games, to which he responded by saying that he wants players to rest easy knowing that they've fixed the issue for Elden Ring's PC release. And once the game is out, they will go back and fix the issue for the Dark Souls games on PC. But yeah, that's pretty much it in terms of new info from the Kitao interview. In other news, this morning, a Good Samaritan let me know on Twitter that they've received PS5 and Xbox copies of Elden Ring at their warehouse. These are likely people's pre-orders that will be sent to retailers and be ready for delivery upon release. And this is as real as it gets, folks. There are copies in warehouses, people's collector's editions have initiated shipping, and perhaps soon there will be copies out in the wild. Though the eBay thing from yesterday wasn't fruitful as they did not receive their copies, so it was likely an error on the retailer's part. But anyway, it's now time to talk about Elden Ring's previews that dropped. So this is your spoiler warning as we will now be discussing some new content from the game that people played. This is again contained to the first couple of hours, but again, you've been warned. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's sum up what we have here. Essentially, a ton of media outlets and some lucky creators got to play 6 hours of the final build of Elden Ring. And no, I wasn't a part of this, so I'm merely collecting and summarizing info that I could find. But anyway, these people were not allowed to record their gameplay. However, they were given a couple of minutes of B-roll footage to have in the background of videos, most of which is just Limgrave and Stormvale areas and no footage from new biomes. Additionally, these people didn't get to download the game or anything as their session was completed through a remote play program known as Parsec, which meant that there were some latency issues, so that's just something to keep in mind. A lot of the info in the last day has already been covered in the Game Informer recap video from the other week, so I'm just gonna go over the new information others gained from their first few hours with the game. Beginning with the starting classes in Elden Ring, which you're gonna see the specifics of in the background as I talk. Anyway, as it turns out, there are exactly 10 classes, and Wretch is indeed its own class. And I'm just glad we got this settled at this point so I can stop worrying about it now. But otherwise, the rest of the classes have the same names as what Game Informer revealed, with the exception of the Intelligencer class, which is now called Confessor for obvious reasons. The Elden Ring Twitter account also officially revealed 2 more classes today. The Bandit, which you're seeing the details of right now, and also the Astrologer class. Aside from the starting classes, we also got information on the burial gifts, which you can see here. There's Crimson Amber Medallion, which is a talisman that increases your max HP. There's Lands Between Rune, which you can immediately use to gain some runes. There's Golden Seed, which increases your total number of flasks. There's Fanged Imp Ashes, a spirit summon. There's Cracked Pot. Then there's the Stone Sword Key, which is the Pharaoh's Slockstone item we already talked about. There's Bewitching Branch, which we don't know what it does yet. A Boiled Prawn, a consumable that boosts your physical damage negation, and finally, Shabriri's Woe, which is an item that causes madness effect upon enemies. Aside from this though, there's also background/archetypes you can pick for your character which have no in-game bearing or effect, but it adds a more of a roleplay feel to the game. You can see each one in the background here, so I'm not going to go through it all for the sake of time. After you pick the starting class, origin, and burial gift, you will come to the character creation screen, in which you have way more customization options than ever before, but if you're in a rush, don't worry, because you can edit your appearance anytime you want later in the game at the hub area. I've already talked about what comes after this with the opening cinematic, tutorial boss, and beginning area, so I'm just gonna skip over that. Though I will say that apparently the Melina cutscene from the Summer Game Fest trailer plays after the opening cinematic, and they've also added a ghostly NPC to the Fringe Folk Hero's grave that makes sure you find the hole to jump in for the tutorial area. Anyway, it's time now to talk about what's changed from the network test in more detail. Firstly, Kale is in the same spot, but he sells different things, such as notes, which are clues that tell you secret locations. Next up, at the Dragon Communion, you will now trade Dragon Hearts for other spells, instead of the Grail's Roar. You will now get things such as Dragon Maw, Dragon Claw, a biting skill, or the familiar Dragon Fire from the network test. This carriage by Stormgate now drops the flail weapon as opposed to the Carolus mask. Ashes of War are now applied by a whetstone knife, which is something you get permanently when you pick up your first Ash of War. And now, in the Demi-Human Cave, you can find tailoring tools, which allow for armor alteration, like customizing your armor and adding or removing cloaks. And this is the same cave where Bach is supposed to appear after you first talk to him near the storm gates. I wonder if he's related to this tailoring in any way. Sorceress Selen is still in the same spot, behind the pumpkin head, which I find to be odd. Also, you can no longer get the Crucible set from this roaming carriage, rather it gives you a great axe instead. Twin blades are now found in the Dragonburnt ruins. There's way less smithing stone shards in the final game. This area that you unlock with the stone sword key is apparently called the First Step. There's a new spirit summon now in the Jellyfish Graveyard called Soldiers of Godric, which summon 1 melee and 1 crossbow soldier. There's a new talisman found early in Limgrave that increases damage done by the final swing, of which there are versions of for specific weapon types. Also, sometimes in the game, it can rain golden leaves, which temporarily buffs you, but we're unsure what this does. And finally, the many-armed enemy in Stormveil has been replaced by a knight that is equally tough to beat. So yeah, that's pretty much it in terms of new stuff from the network test. Now, let's talk about new mechanics and miscellaneous facts. So, we already know that golden seeds are what increases your flask amount, which is basically the equivalent to an Estus shard. And we know that they're found at minor Erdtrees. However, we also now know that Sacred Tear is the item which increases the potency of your flasks. This is essentially equivalent to the Undead Bone Shard from past games. These Sacred Tears are found at Churches of Marika, which are shrines scattered throughout the lands between, and they're fairly common from what I've read. Additionally, the place to find a map fragment is marked as a bright spot on the blank map, so you'll know the whereabouts of where you can find a fragment that will uncover the map of that area. People remarked that they found a ton of map fragments in their first few hours, so expect to be on the lookout for them at these structures. Anyway, remember this bell tower creature? Well, supposedly they are scattered in Limgrave and Liurnia, and if you go inside, you will learn that they have a mechanic called Remembrance, which apparently allows for the duplication of boss souls. Cause if you recall, killing Godric gives you a boss soul known as Remembrance of Godric. And I think this is good, for when a boss soul can be transposed into multiple weapons, then you won't need multiple playthroughs to get all of those items. Also, another new thing is that your equip weight is now tied to the stamina stat as opposed to the strength, like it was in the network test. This change makes sense, as stamina is more of a universal stat that nearly every build will have to level up, whereas strength is more selective. Additionally, we now know that some weapons can be upgraded as far as plus 12, as one upgrade materials description in the Underground City mentions it. There is also an upgrade material similar to Twinkling Titanite in the game that is used to upgrade unique weapons. Memory slots in Elden Ring, aka the amount of spells you can equip, is not tied to any stat in the game. Rather, the way to increase it is by simply finding more memory slots throughout the world. I'm not sure if this is tied to story progression or what, but I just know that it's not something you can merely level up like in past games. Anyway, that one painting quest we discovered back during the network test rewards you with a quirky helmet as opposed to the placeholder item we found. It's also been confirmed that the Chameleon spell is in the game through an item called Mimic's Veil, so basically the same thing as a young white branch. Also, in some areas of the game you will find glowing skulls on the ground that you can crush to gain some runes, which is what I'm assuming we're seeing here. Also, some NPCs who are tarnished like yourself tell you that they can't see the guidance of grace that emits from the checkpoints like you can. And the final miscellaneous fact is that there is a lifesteal Ash of War for the Caestus weapon in the game. Yes, Elden Ring will have the Caestus. Alright, so for Game Informer, I tried to summarize things through characters, but this time, let's try to do it through different areas. Beginning with the Weeping Peninsula, which is to the south of Limgrave. Firstly, we finally got a look at what Irina looks like. She's the NPC you meet past the Bridge of Sacrifice who's escaped from her home, Castle Morn, as there's an ongoing civil war there. She tells you to deliver a letter to her father Edgar, and once you do that, Edgar mentions that he's grateful, but says he can't leave the castle. After this, if you go back to Irina, you will find her body absolutely slaughtered. And then, if you go back to the castle a second time, Edgar is no longer there. So quite a doozy of a questline, and I have a feeling that it's not the end of it there. Aside from Castle Morn though, Weeping Peninsula offers some other things, like a unique demi-human queen staff, a spirit candelabra, some giant rat mobs, and some locations with trapdoors. This area also gives you a new torch with a skill that allows you to blow fire into enemies. Moving on up from the Weeping Peninsula though, let's talk about Eastern Limgrave. Specifically, Summon Water, which I mentioned last week is the area where you will fight the Bone Beckoner Mariner boss. However, they have now changed this boss's name to the Tibium Mariner instead. And I gotta say, I was really disappointed when I read this, because I thought the name Bone Beckoner Mariner was the coolest thing ever, and it kinda reminded me of the old school Scooby-Doo villains. But alas, it will now join the list of forgotten Elden Ring names like Riftlands, Foggy Sea, and Tragic Things. Anyway, you will also find new Ashes of War in Eastern Limgrave, such as a Sacred One, and a Bow Ash of War that creates a shot that pierces defenses. This is also the area with the bears, who apparently guard caves that have special equipment and mini-bosses, but the main attraction here is this seemingly innocent-looking mausoleum, which we all know by now is the gateway to the Eternal City. This underground area has its own map and map fragments, and if you recall back in August, the Gamescom press, who saw a demo of Elden Ring, noted that the map had a button which said, "Show Subterranean Labyrinth," which we now know it's for the Eternal City area. Essentially, you can toggle between the underworld and overworld map with the press of a button. Anyway, the sky underground seems cracked, with a Parthenon-looking flying castle, along with a ton of giant ruins and buildings. The river flowing through this area is called the Shifra River, and it has a moonlight feel to it. There are also pillars lining up on the path to an area called the Hallowborn Grounds, where if you keep exploring, you will see the corpse of a familiar stag resting within some temple ruins. You find the map fragment for this area here, along with a special altar that allows you to light a flame. Interacting with this causes one of the pillars on the stairs leading up to the stag to light up as well. Eventually, after lining up all the altars in the area and going back to the stag, its corpse is now interactable. Touch it and you will get transported into a cave and begin the boss fight with the ancestor spirit. A floaty and magical boss fight, but one that is very tough to fight. Aside from housing this fight though, the underground area has many other secrets, tough enemies, and teleport locations that take you to other areas. A magical place indeed that I'm glad they haven't really visually shown off just yet. Moving on from the underground though, let's travel further east of Limgrave to the Badlands, aka the desert biome known as Caelid. The first thing you'll encounter is a great sword-wielding NPC invader named Anastasia, who wears the queen armor seen in this old screenshot. After this encounter, you come across a mini-boss named Erdtree Avatar, as he's guiding one of the minor Erdtrees. This mini-boss looks like a broken rotted tree and uses physical and magical attacks. And I just gotta pause here for a sec. You're telling me that this game has a boss named Azula and another one named Avatar? I guess Miyazaki is a man of culture after all. But anyway, Caelid as a whole is a very large, deserted landscape with little to no vegetation and filled with dogs and crows that have enormous heads. The northern part of Caelid is called Grael's Dragon Barrow. And this is where you'll come across a bunch of dragons that start chasing you, and then further along you eventually encounter the mother dragon named Grael. So essentially, not a very friendly zone. Later on in Caelid, you will find a tower that dominates the entire area, and near it, another mini-boss guarding a minor Erdtree, this one being named Putrid Avatar. And I'm starting to sense a pattern here. This biome also has some other areas like Caelid Ruins, a Sanctum area, and more Pumpkinhead enemies that are much tougher to fight. You will also find an Everjail nearby which starts a fight against a diseased dragon. So in summary, Caelid equals dragons, so not a very beginner friendly area from the looks of it. Moving on though, let's talk about the area north of Stormvale, Liurnia of the Lakes. At the beginning of it, you will meet a novice mage who sells you basic sorceries. Then there's also another vendor that gives you the astrologer set and a lantern, something that you can equip on your belt similar to Bloodborne. In Liurnia, you will discover new cookbooks that will teach you how to craft faux sorceries, which craft temporary spells such as freezing grease, a feature useful for non-magic builds. This area also contains the previously seen human centipede enemy from the Summer Game Fest trailer. Though eventually in this area you will run into, you guessed it, a poison swamp, and fortunately Torrent seems to be immune to it, so you can just get on it and ride away without having to deal with its effect. Further along the northern part though, you will come across the 4 belfries. Near here, you will find a treasure chest that has a key in it, and you can use it on an imp seal nearby, teleporting you to a familiar area. Apparently, it takes you back to the tutorial area of the game, the Chapel of Anticipation, giving you another chance to fight the Grafted Scion. Apparently, this chapel is that island we saw on the west of Stormvale that we obviously couldn't go to in the network test. But now we know that's where we essentially start the game and die a scripted death. So yeah, that's pretty much it in terms of a quick summary for the Lucaria area. But now, it's time we move on to the Roundtable Hold. I've already talked about this in depth, but we did learn some new things about it. Namely, players unlock this area at different times, and I believe it might have to do with how many new grace points you've discovered. Eventually though, Melina shows up and whisks you away to the Roundtable Hold. You apparently can't hurt any NPCs in the hub, something that they added in Sekiro where you couldn't hurt NPCs in the starting area or in Kuro's room. And we now know that the Twin Maiden Husks give you the PvP Blue Sentinel item, which is called the Blue Cipher Ring. We also learned that Blacksmith Hugh has the ability to duplicate your Ashes of War so you can use them on more than just one weapon. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, you can rename your character and customize its appearance for free at a mirror near Fia's room in the Roundtable Hold. So yeah, that's pretty much it in terms of new things for the hub area. And finally, it's time to talk about one last location in Elden Ring. Somewhere in eastern Limgrave, there's a building called the Tower of Return, which is seemingly a normal looking tower. However, in it there is a chest, and once you open it, there's no items. Instead, it teleports you to a place far, far north of the map, an area called Leyndell, the royal capital. There's a giant golem there that is very tough to fight, and this is presumably the area of the map that protects the Erdtree, and seemingly the farthest anyone got past Lucaria from all the previews that I read, an area that we will likely not know more about until release. But yeah, that pretty much sums it up in terms of the new information we gained from all the previews. I tried to read and watch as many as I feasibly could in the last day. There were also some foreign outlets who got to play this and whose impressions I didn't get to explore quite as much, but regardless, I think this should provide a solid overview of the first few hours of Elden Ring. I've linked all the sources and articles and videos in the description if you'd like to check them out for yourself. So hopefully you found this video to be informative, and I appreciate you for sticking around till the end. We don't have much longer to go now, just 2 weeks left. So anyway, this has been your daily Elden Ring update for February 11th, 2022.
This game, I think, will be the best game that is the best game of all time. There it is.